Hi, folks. It's Jamie Satterfield with KnoxNews.com. I'm outside Knox County Criminal Court, where Joel Guy Jr., 32 years old, is being tried on charges of first-degree murder, felony murder, and abuse of a corpse in the slaying on Thanksgiving 2016 weekend of his parents, Joel Guy Sr., who was 61, and Lisa Guy, who was 55. The couple had been married 31 years, and they had Joel Guy was their son, and then he also had sisters, three sisters. The allegation is that Joel Guy Jr. Planned to kill his parents because they were going to cut him off. He was at that time a 28-year-old college student who had never worked a paying job, and his parents were preparing to retire. Wanted to stop paying his bills, and the state alleges that Joel Guy Jr., as early as November 7 of 2016, started buying products that he would need in order to kill his parents, chop up their bodies, and try to dissolve their bones. If you've been following this case at all, you know that he was interrupted, the allegation is, in that process because he cut himself. It ended up, he did dismember these bodies, but was not successful in his effort to make them disappear. Today is day 3 in this trial, and the defense is not really putting up a defense. There's not a lot of dispute that Joel Guy Jr. authored what I've been calling a murder book. It was handwritten notes, detailed accounting of how these crimes would be committed, in what order he would kill his parents to maximize his profit, and how he intended to dispose of the bodies. Today, Michael McCracken was sent to the witness stand by the state, by prosecutors Leslie Nacios and Hector Sanchez. Mr. McCracken was a longtime friend of Joel Guy Jr. They went to a boarding school together. And then they also roomed together for a while in Baton Rouge, where both were attending classes at Louisiana State University. Mr. McCracken had moved, and so he had kind of lost contact with Joel Guy Jr. when he sees a newspaper article about these killings. And Joel Guy Jr. called Mr. McCracken from jail in December of 2016, so just a little bit after these murders were committed. And jurors heard a portion of that phone call, and in it, Mr. McCracken says, "I don't know what to say." And he tells him he sees this article, and he says, "You've been my best friend my entire life." At one point, he tells him to consider me dead. I'm assuming consider me dead to you. He says, and this was a little shocking. He says, "I'm not totally surprised." The idea being he wasn't totally surprised that his friend had committed these murders. He says, "I'm angry and lost and confused and disappointed." On the phone call, Joel Guy Jr. says to him, "I think about you all the time. You were one of the no, I'm sorry, you were the only good thing in my life." So in that phone call, or at least the portion that the jury heard, there's no admission of guilt from Joel Guy Jr., but he certainly doesn't challenge what his friend has seen in the newspaper. Michael McCracken went on to testify that Joel Guy Jr. had always been socially awkward, and that as he got older, it got worse, and that he very often spent a lot of time in his bedroom with a computer. And the defense decided to take advantage of the fact that Mr. McCracken was called as a witness to have him talk a little bit about what he knew about Joel Guy Jr.'s parents and his siblings. And as it turned out, Mr. McCracken said he didn't even know that Joel Guy Jr. had sisters, and that he knew that Joel Guy Jr. occasionally talked to his mother. He knew that the mother was paying Joel Guy Jr.'s bills. But the impression was left that Mr. Joel Guy Jr. was being shunned by his family, being ignored by his family. And of course, prosecutor Leslie Nacios objected to that and said that the defense was taking that somewhat out of context and raising the idea, trying to get sympathy from the jury for Mr. Joel Guy Jr. And she asked the judge to allow her to explore that a little more, to play the entire phone call, perhaps even to call some witnesses, Joel Guy Jr.'s sisters, for instance, to show what she says. And what she says is it wasn't the family that was shunning Joel Guy Jr. It was Joel Guy Jr. who wanted nothing to do with his family except for them to pay his bills. And bottom line is, Judge Steve Seward did not allow her to play the entire phone call, but she was able to ask Mr. McCracken a few follow-up questions that made it clear that Joel Guy Jr. had never talked much about his family at all. And she was able to suggest through her questioning that if there was tension in this family, that it was Joel Guy Jr. that was the problem, not his parents. So that was the big testimony for today. We expect later this afternoon a forensic anthropologist, Murray Marks, to testify. He's from the University of Tennessee. I've known him for 30 years. He's really good at what he does. He's going to be talking about the cutting injuries on the bones to try to help jurors perhaps understand exactly what order these killings were carried out. The state alleges that Joel Guy waited till his mother went to the store, killed his father while she was gone, and then attacked her when she returned as soon as she walked in the door with groceries. Murray Marks will be able to testify about the injuries on the bones because if you've been following this case, you may know, and if you haven't, I will tell you now, that Mr. Guy's hands were severed. Both of the guy's torsos were severed. Mrs. Guy's head was cut off and placed in a pot for the purposes of boiling down, again, trying to dissolve bones. So these bodies were dismembered, and that impacted the ability to determine exactly what occurred to them. And that's why they need Murray Marks, who can look at these bones and the wounds on the bones and explain this more to jurors. So we'll have that this afternoon. And then I expect that tomorrow morning the state will put on an assistant medical examiner who conducted autopsies. And then the state may well rest. And at this point, we're not sure if the defense is going to attempt to put on any witnesses. I will be here tomorrow and covering this case, and I'll be giving you an update. You can follow me on Twitter at Jamie Scoop is my handle. And KnoxNews.com is streaming this trial live, and you can read my coverage there as well. So I encourage you to visit our website, and I will see you folks tomorrow.